The harsh fluorescent lights of Mount Sinai Hospital's research lab buzzed overhead as Dr. Sarah Chen peered through her microscope, meticulously documenting the cellular changes she'd spent the last 3 years studying. Her phone chirped softly another email. She almost ignored it, as she did with most mid-afternoon interruptions, but something made her glance at the notification. Sender David Chen. Subject: we need to talk. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she set down her pipette. In 12 years of marriage, David had never sent an email to discuss anything important. Their relationship had always been about intimate conversations over dinner, lazy Sunday morning discussions in bed, and face-to-face resolutions to any disagreements. But had always been. Until 6 months ago, when something shifted. The changes were subtle at first: late nights at the office, missed dinner dates, distracted conversations. Sarah's mind drifted to their anniversary dinner last month, when David barely looked up from his phone, his tie slightly askew, a faint trace of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his collar. She opened the email. Sarah, I don't know how to say this, so I'll just say it. Jessica is pregnant. Yes, that Jessica, my assistant. I've been seeing her for the past 8 months. She's keeping the baby, and I want a divorce. I know this isn't the right way to tell you, but I couldn't face you. I'm sorry. David. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. Jessica, 26 years old. The bubbly blonde who'd started at David's law firm last year, who'd smiled too brightly at their firm's Christmas party, who'd called their home once at midnight claiming she needed David's signature on urgent papers. Sarah's gaze drifted to the family photo on her desk, her and David in Maui last summer, both smiling, his arms wrapped around her waist. 5 years of fertility treatments hidden behind those smiles. 5 years of negative pregnancy tests, of hormone injections, of hope and disappointment cycling endlessly like the seasons. Her computer screen dimmed, snapping her back to the present. Her colleagues bustled around the lab, unaware that her world had just imploded. Dr. Williams passed by, raising an eyebrow at her unusual stillness. Everything okay, Sarah? She nodded mechanically, her mind already racing ahead. The email's timestamp was only 3 minutes old. David would be waiting for her response, probably staring at his phone, perhaps with Jessica hovering nearby. They'd expect tears, hysteria, angry accusations. Sarah took a deep breath and opened her bottom desk drawer. Behind her stack of research papers lay a small notepad where she'd been documenting David's suspicious behavior for months: calls, late nights, unexplained expenses. She'd told herself she was being paranoid, that her scientific mind was seeing patterns where none existed. Now, as she pulled out the notepad and flipped through its pages, a plan began to form. Her fingers moved to the keyboard, steady now, as she crafted her reply. Sometimes, she thought, the most devastating response is the one your opponent least expects. They met during a rainstorm at Columbia University's Butler Library. Sarah was a pre-med junior, huddled over biochemistry textbooks, when David's coffee cup accidentally spilled across her carefully color-coded notes. Instead of anger, she'd felt an inexplicable urge to laugh at his mortified expression and fumbling apologies. The future lawyer, usually so eloquent, could barely string together a coherent sentence in her presence. I swear I'm normally more coordinated, he'd stammered, desperately trying to mop up the mess with his designer jacket sleeve. Let me buy you dinner to make up for it. That dinner turned into weekly study dates, which evolved into late-night conversations about their dreams. David spoke passionately about environmental law and his plans to make partner by 35. Sarah shared her ambitions of revolutionizing cancer treatment through cellular research. They were 21 and 23, respectively, and the world seemed to bend toward their combined will. Their wedding, 5 years later, was everything their Chinese parents had hoped for: a perfect blend of traditional and modern, just like them. Sarah wore a kipao for the tea ceremony and a white gown for the reception. David's father gave a tearful speech about his son marrying a doctor, while Sarah's mother beamed with pride at her daughter landing a successful lawyer. "We're going to have it all," David had whispered during their first dance. The careers, the family, the house with the white picket fence, everything. For the first 7 years, they did have it all. Sarah's research garnered attention in medical journals. while David made partner 2 years ahead of schedule. They bought a brownstone in Park Slope, decorated it with artifacts from their travels, and designated the third bedroom as a future nursery. Their friends called them the power couple, and their Christmas cards looked like magazine covers. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a negative pregnancy test, then another, and another. "It's fine," David would say, holding her after each disappointment. "We have time. We're both still young." But time became their enemy. Sarah threw herself into fertility treatments with the same dedication she applied to her research. She tracked ovulation cycles, administered hormone injections, and scheduled their intimacy around peak fertility windows. Sex became a clinical affair, marked by temperature readings and ovulation strips rather than passion. David supported her through the first 3 years of treatments, attending every appointment, holding her hand through each procedure. But something changed during the 4th year. The light in his eyes dimmed whenever she mentioned baby names or nursery colors. He started scheduling late meetings on days she had fertility appointments. "Maybe we should take a break," he suggested after their 3rd failed IVF attempt. "Focus on our careers for a while. The treatments are taking a toll on both of us." Sarah noticed the signs but chose to interpret them through the lens of stress. When David started working late every Tuesday and Thursday, she told herself he was pursuing a big environmental case. When he bought a new cologne and started hitting the gym more frequently, she attributed it to a midlife fitness kick. When he stopped asking about her research, the one thing they'd always shared passionate discussions about, she blamed it on work pressure. The most glaring warning came during their trip to Shanghai last spring. They were visiting Sarah's grandmother, who was battling late-stage lung cancer. In a moment of clarity, the elderly woman had gripped Sarah's hand and spoken in rapid-fire Mandarin. "Something is wrong with your husband's heart," she'd said. "I see it in his eyes when he looks at you. The warmth has gone." Sarah had dismissed her grandmother's words as medication-induced confusion. After all, David had been perfectly attentive during the trip, if a bit distracted by work emails. She didn't want to acknowledge that those emails always seemed to arrive around 10 p.m. New York time, when a certain assistant would just be starting her workday. Now, sitting in her lab with David's confession glowing on her screen, Sarah realized she'd been running her own experiment for the past year, testing the hypothesis that if she just worked harder, loved more deeply, succeeded more brilliantly, she could keep her marriage intact. Like any good scientist, she should have acknowledged the data sooner: the late nights, the emotional distance, the subtle changes in behavior that added up to a seismic shift. She glanced at her current research notes: a groundbreaking study on cellular regeneration that could revolutionize cancer treatment. While her personal life had been crumbling, she'd been making remarkable progress in her professional one. Perhaps that should have been another warning sign. Success rarely came without sacrifice, and lately, all the sacrifices had been on her side of the ledger. The irony wasn't lost on her that, while she'd been trying to create new life in a petri dish, her husband had managed to create one the old-fashioned way, just not with her. Sarah looked at her wedding ring, a simple platinum band that had never left her finger in 12 years. With steady hands, the same hands that had performed countless delicate laboratory procedures, she slowly twisted it off. Jessica Martinez sashayed into David Chen's law firm wearing Jimmy Choo heels and carrying a resume padded with half-truths. At 26, she'd already mastered the art of being precisely what powerful men wanted to see: competent enough to be useful, young enough to be flattering, and vulnerable enough to need protecting. "I just really admire your work in environmental law," she'd gushed during the interview, leaning forward just enough to seem eager but not desperate. "Especially the Richardson case. The way you handled that class action suit was brilliant." David had preened under her attention, conveniently forgetting that the Richardson case had been Sarah's suggestion, one of many dinner conversations where his wife's quick mind had helped untangle legal knots. Jessica was hired the next day. The affair began with small moments: coffee brought to his office exactly how he liked it, information gleaned from careful observation, casual touches while reviewing documents, late-night takeout during case preparations. Jessica played the role of devoted assistant perfectly, staying late whenever David did, creating opportunities for their shoulders to brush as they pored over legal briefs. "Your wife must miss you, working such long hours," she'd mentioned softly, her voice carrying just the right note of concern. Then, After a calculated pause, it must be hard, being married to someone so focused on her career. David found himself confiding in Jessica about the fertility struggles, the scheduled intimacy, the way his home had become a laboratory of disappointment. Jessica listened with wide-eyed sympathy, offering comfort that gradually became physical. A consoling hand on his shoulder evolved into lingering hugs, which transformed into stolen kisses in his office after hours. "I've never felt this way about anyone," she'd whisper, making him feel powerful, desired, young again. "But I would never want to hurt your wife." The disclaimer was always there, painting her as reluctant, conflicted, even as she unbuttoned her blouse. Their affair was conducted in luxury hotels booked under the firm's expense account, justified as client meetings or conference attendances. Jessica proved skilled at creating paper trails that looked innocent on the surface. She was equally adept at making sure certain colleagues caught glimpses of their relationship colleagues who would later serve as witnesses to their genuine connection. The pregnancy announcement came strategically, just after David had won a major case. They were celebrating in his office, the hour well past midnight, the city lights twinkling beyond his corner office windows. "I'm keeping it," Jessica declared, one hand protectively over her stomach. "I know this complicates things, but I've always wanted to be a mother." Her eyes welled with tears. "I understand if you don't want to be involved." David had walked right into the trap, promising immediate support, swearing he'd handle everything. Jessica waited 3 days before delivering her ultimatum, perfectly timed during a vulnerable moment when they were tangled in hotel sheets. "I can't be your secret anymore," she'd said, her voice trembling. "Not with our baby coming. I need to know you're fully committed to us." A pause, then the killer blow besides. "Don't you think Sarah deserves a chance at happiness with someone who can give her a family?" The email to Sarah hadn't been David's idea. He'd wanted to have the conversation in person, to explain himself, to somehow justify his actions. But Jessica had convinced him otherwise. "It'll be kinder this way," she'd insisted. "A clean break. No messy scenes, no drawn-out explanations. You know how intense Sarah can get about things. This way she can process it privately, with dignity." So David had composed the email from his office, Jessica reading over his shoulder, suggesting edits to make it gentler. He'd typed and retyped it dozens of times, finally settling on brutal brevity. His cursor hovered over the send button for nearly an hour before he clicked, his hand shaking slightly. Jessica had immediately hugged him, whispering praise about his bravery, his decency in being honest. She'd already begun making plans. They would need a bigger apartment. She should probably quit her job with a generous severance, of course. They could announce their relationship after a respectable interval. "Just think," she'd said, "in a few months we'll have everything we've dreamed of. A real family." David sat now in his office, staring at his sent email, waiting for Sarah's response. He expected anger, hysteria, perhaps even threats. Sarah had always been passionate, emotional about things that mattered to her. He'd prepared himself for the worst, had even warned his partners about potential scene at the office. What he hadn't prepared for was silence. No immediate response, no phone calls, no appearance at his office, just the quiet hum of his computer and Jessica's occasional texts asking if he'd heard anything yet. He glanced at the photo on his desk, he and Sarah at their wedding, both beaming at the camera. He'd been meaning to remove it for weeks, but somehow hadn't gotten around to it. Now, looking at Sarah's radiant smile, he felt the first stirrings of doubt. There was something about her silence that made him uneasy, something that reminded him of the way she approached her research, methodical, patient, and utterly devastating in her conclusions. In the quiet of her lab, Sarah allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to fall apart. She locked herself in the supply closet, pressed her face into a lab coat, and let the tears flow silently. 12 years of memories crashed over her like waves. Their first apartment with the leaky faucet, Sunday dim sum with their families, David holding her through failed pregnancy tests, the dream of their future family crumbling like sand through her fingers. 9 minutes and 30 seconds later, she straightened her spine, wiped her face, and emerged transformed. Dr. Sarah Chen, the scientist who'd pioneered breakthrough cancer research protocols, took control. She'd analyzed this situation like any other experiment, gather data, form a hypothesis, test it methodically. Her first call wasn't to David, or her mother, or even her therapist. Instead, she dialed Elena Martinez, her college roommate turned corporate investigator. I need everything you can find on Jessica Thompson, currently working at Chen Williams Law. And Elena, I need it yesterday. While Elena worked her magic, Sarah threw herself into her own investigation. Years of research had taught her the value of thorough documentation. She pulled up her notepad, reviewing months of observations, David's late nights, unexplained expenses, subtle behavior changes. Like assembling a puzzle, she began to see the complete picture. Elena's report arrived within hours, and it was more illuminating than Sarah had dared hope. Jessica Thompson had a history: 3 previous law firms, 3 married attorneys, 2 prior pregnancy claims. Each situation had ended with generous settlements and non-disclosure agreements. The pattern was so clear it could have been published in a peer-reviewed journal. She's good, Elena admitted during their follow-up call. She covers her tracks well, uses different names, moves between cities. But she always targets the same type: successful older men, usually in their 40s, often in partnerships or positions of power. Sarah's next call was to Margaret Wu, her closest friend and one of New York's most ruthless divorce attorneys. They met at a small cafe 3 blocks from Sarah's lab, where Margaret reviewed Elena's findings with growing interest. "This is perfect," Margaret declared, her red lipstick curving into a predatory smile. "But we need to play this carefully. If we move too fast, they'll have time to construct a defense. The key is to let them think they're in control." Sarah nodded, her scientist's mind already formulating the experiment. "What's the most important variable?" "Time," Margaret replied. "We need her to think she's won, to get comfortable enough to make mistakes. And most importantly, we need that paternity test." They crafted Sarah's response together, weighing each word like carefully measured reagents in an experiment. It needed to appear emotional enough to be believable, but controlled enough to advance their strategy. After 7 drafts, they had it. David. "Your email was unexpected, but perhaps not as surprising as you might think. If this is what you truly want, I won't fight you. However, given our history and the suddenness of this news, I have one condition: a paternity test. I believe we both deserve absolute certainty before ending our marriage." Sarah. "Perfect," Margaret said, reading it over one final time. "It implies acceptance while introducing just enough doubt to make them nervous. Plus, it gives us time to gather more evidence." Sarah sent the email from her lab computer, her hands steady as she clicked send. Then she opened her research notes and immersed herself in work, knowing that across town her message would be causing considerable disruption to David's afternoon. The waiting began. Sarah maintained her routine with scientific precision, arriving at the lab by 7 a.m., running her experiments, publishing her research. She ignored the curious glances from colleagues who'd noticed she'd stopped wearing her wedding ring. She declined lunch invitations and kept her phone on silent, creating an atmosphere of calculated isolation. Friends who knew the truth marveled at her composure. They didn't understand that this was how Sarah processed trauma, by transforming it into a controlled experiment. Each day was carefully documented: David's increasingly anxious texts ignored, Jessica's attempts to friend her on social media documented and screenshotted, the whispers at medical charity events they both still attended recorded in her growing file. Late at night, in the solitude of her home office, Sarah would sometimes allow herself to examine the profound grief beneath her clinical approach. She'd look at photos from happier times and wonder how she'd missed the signs, how the man who'd once been her best friend had become a stranger capable of such betrayal. But even in these moments of vulnerability, she never wavered from the plan. She knew from her research that the most groundbreaking discoveries often required patience, precision, and the courage to follow the evidence wherever it led. Just as she'd learned to wait for cell cultures to grow, for test results to process, for hypotheses to be proven or disproven, she would wait now. Because Sarah had made one crucial observation that David had forgotten in all their years together: she had never acted without purpose, never made a move without calculating all possible outcomes. Her response wasn't just a request for proof, it was the first step in a carefully designed protocol that would reveal every truth David and Jessica thought they had buried. The game was beginning, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt truly in control. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to both parties' lawyers in sealed envelopes. Sarah sat in Margaret Wu's office, her posture perfect, hands folded calmly in her lap, as her attorney opened the envelope with deliberate precision. Margaret's smile was razor-sharp as she read the results. 0% probability of paternity. Sarah absorbed the information with the same composure she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. Inside, a weight lifted not because she wanted her marriage back, but because the truth was finally emerging, clean and clinical as lab results. Across town, in David's corner office, the revelation hit differently. He stared at the results, color draining from his face, while Jessica's carefully constructed facade began to crack. "There must be a mistake," Jessica stammered, one hand protectively over her stomach. "We'll demand another test." But David wasn't listening. His legal mind was finally engaging, reviewing the past months with new clarity. Every late-night conversation, every tearful confession, every carefully orchestrated moment, all of it orchestrated by the woman now pacing his office in increasingly desperate circles. "Who is the father?" Jessica, his voice was quiet, dangerous. Jessica's answer was cut off by a knock at the door. Thomas Richardson, a junior partner from the firm's corporate division, stood in the doorway, his face ashen. "I think we all need to talk." The story unraveled like a poorly stitched seam. Richardson confessed to a brief affair with Jessica 3 months before she'd set her sights on David. He'd ended it when he discovered similar allegations at her previous firm's information he'd been too ashamed to share until the DNA results forced his hand. "She told me she was on birth control," Richardson explained, while David sat motionless behind his desk. "When she said she was pregnant, I panicked. Then suddenly she was with you, and I thought I was off the hook." Jessica's carefully constructed world collapsed in real time. Her phone buzzed constantly. Margaret Wu had been busy, reaching out to her previous victims, unraveling NDAs with surgical precision. By afternoon, 3 other executives had come forward with similar stories. David's attempts to reach Sarah began immediately. Calls, texts, emails all met with silence. He sent flowers to her lab with handwritten apologies. She donated them to the hospital's pediatric ward. He waited outside her office, but she'd anticipated this, arranging her schedule so their paths never crossed. Finally, he resorted to sending a formal letter through Margaret. "Sarah, I was a fool. I destroyed something precious for a lie, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. Please give me a chance to explain, to make amends. I love you. I've always loved you. David." Sarah read the letter in her lab while monitoring cell cultures. Her response, sent through official channels, was brief. "David. Love requires trust. Trust requires truth. We have neither." Sarah. The scandal broke in legal circles like a thunderclap. Jessica's previous settlements were revealed, her pattern of targeting successful lawyers exposed. Each story followed the same script: the devoted assistant, the staged late nights, the miraculous pregnancy, the demands for support. She'd refined her technique over years, learning from each success, adapting her approach like a virus evolving to survive. David watched his professional reputation crater. Partners avoided eye contact in hallways. Clients requested different attorneys. The firm's HR department launched an internal investigation, uncovering expense reports that told their own damning story. The final blow came when Jessica, cornered by mounting evidence, attempted one last manipulation. She called a meeting with the firm's senior partners, offering to resign quietly in exchange for a substantial settlement. She found herself facing Margaret Wu instead. A mess. Margaret began, sliding photos across the conference table. "Would you like to explain these?" The images showed Jessica meeting with her previous targets, documenting a pattern of deliberate deception spanning years. Jessica's mask finally cracked completely. She ran from the room in tears, leaving behind her designer handbag and, most tellingly, the pregnancy pad that had fallen from beneath her dress as she fled. News traveled fast in legal circles. By evening, Sarah had received calls from 3 other prestigious firms, each offering her husband's position to her instead. She declined them all, focusing on her research with renewed intensity. But David made one final attempt at reconciliation, waiting outside her lab late one evening. He'd lost weight, his designer suit hanging loose on his frame. "Sarah, please. What can I do to fix this?" She really looked at him for the first time since the email. She saw the man she'd loved, the future she'd planned, the life they'd built. and she saw how easily he'd discarded it all for a convenient lie. "Nothing," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Some things, once broken, can't be fixed. They can only be learned from." She walked past him into the cool evening air, leaving him standing in the shadow of the building where she was making breakthrough discoveries in cellular regeneration. The irony wasn't lost on her while she worked to heal others at a cellular level. Some damages were beyond repair. The truth had unraveled everything, but in doing so, it had set her free. The confrontation happened where their story began in Butler Library at Columbia University. Sarah had agreed to meet David after receiving his 20th apologetic email, choosing this location deliberately. But among these towering bookshelves, surrounded by ambitious students chasing their dreams, she'd once fallen in love with a man who promised her the world. "I thought it was fitting," she said, gesturing to their surroundings, "to end things where they started." David looked smaller somehow, his expensive suit failing to mask his diminished presence. "It doesn't have to end, Sarah. We could start over, go to counseling." "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about cellular memory, how cells retain information about trauma. It's fascinating, really. Even after the damage is repaired, the cell remembers. It adapts. It protects itself." She placed a folder on the table between them, divorce papers, already signed on her side. "I don't want to start over, David. I want to move forward." "Is this about the fertility treatments? Because we could try again." "This is about truth," Sarah cut in. "You didn't just betray our marriage, you betrayed my trust in my own judgment. While I was questioning myself, blaming my body, my career, you were crafting elaborate lies." She leaned forward, meeting his eyes. "But here's what I realized: I'm not the one who failed us. You are." The truth landed like a physical blow. David slumped in his chair, decades of shared history crumbling between them. But 2 days later, Sarah received the news that would change her life. Her research team had made a breakthrough in cancer treatment. Their new protocol for cellular regeneration showed unprecedented success rates in clinical trials. As she stared at the results, tears streaming down her face, her phone buzzed with congratulatory messages. The first came from Elena Martinez: "You're a genius in more ways than one. Dinner tonight. The whole gang's coming." The gang turned out to be an unexpected support system that had emerged from the ashes of her marriage. Elena, Margaret, and a group of women she'd met through her medical research formed a fierce circle of protection and encouragement. They celebrated her victories, both personal and professional, with champagne and brutal honesty. But to Sarah, Margaret toasted, raising her glass, who proved that the best revenge is living brilliantly. The media attention from her medical breakthrough brought unexpected opportunities. She was invited to speak at international conferences, consulted on groundbreaking research projects, and approached by pharmaceutical companies eager to develop her protocols. At one such conference in Singapore, she found herself sharing her story with a room full of young female scientists. Success isn't just about the experiments that work, she told them. It's about having the courage to recognize when something is failing and the strength to start again, whether that's a research protocol or a marriage. The speaking circuit brought her to Los Angeles, where she ran into Jessica's first victim, another successful attorney who'd rebuilt his life after her deception. "You know what the hardest part was?" he confided over coffee. "Forgiving myself for being fooled. But you turned it into a victory. You inspired a lot of us." Sarah's research continued to flourish. She threw herself into her work with renewed passion, no longer feeling guilty about late nights in the lab or missed social events. She was changing lives, saving lives, and for the first time in years, she felt completely, unreservedly herself. One evening, as she was leaving the lab, she passed a young couple arguing near the hospital entrance. The woman was in tears, the man defensive and angry. Without thinking, Sarah handed the woman her card. "Whatever you decide," she said softly, "make sure it's your choice." Later that night, surrounded by research papers in her home office, Sarah caught her reflection in the window. She saw strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a certainty in her posture that spoke of lessons learned and battles won. She picked up her phone and sent a group text to her support circle: "Lab results are in. Protocol success rate now at 92%. Drinks tomorrow." The responses flooded in immediately, full of heart emojis and celebration plans. Sarah smiled, realizing that while she'd lost a husband, she'd gained something far more valuable herself. A year had passed, and Sarah barely recognized the woman she used to be. The timid, unsure version of herself had faded, replaced by someone who walked with confidence and spoke with certainty. Her success wasn't just professional, though she had made incredible strides in her career, it was personal too. She no longer sought validation in places that drained her. Instead, she found it within. The journey to self-worth had been anything but easy, but every challenge, every heartbreak had taught her something valuable. She had learned that loving herself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. That setting boundaries wasn't cruelty, it was self-respect. And that choosing herself again and again was the most powerful decision she could ever make. Now, standing at the threshold of something new, she no longer feared change. She welcomed it. There was an open road ahead, filled with possibilities she had once been too afraid to embrace. The past no longer held her captive, it had simply shaped her into the woman she was meant to be. With one last glance at the life she had left behind, Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward. This time she was ready.